The Williams FW23, the machine that conquered Imola in 2001. A legendary driver duo, a monster BMW engine, and a livery that remains absolutely iconic. Get ready for stunning decals that sometimes refused to cooperate, painting blind without a proper blueprint, and, once again, a faulty manual. Luckily, those chunky 2001 aero regulations mean this rear wing won't completely break my spirit this time. Join me for the build, the struggles, and the final reveal. Let's get into it. As with every project, the first step is dealing with all those mold lines and bits of flash. I also had to sand this area back a little, otherwise the TV camera on top wouldn't fit properly. The lower chassis section needed some attention as well. I had to remove a bit of material there so everything would slot together nicely. One thing to keep in mind is that it's often worth sanding just a tiny bit more than you think you need. I made sure the fit was perfect here, but once you add primer and paint, those tolerances get a lot tighter. If you don't clean that up afterwards, parts that fit perfectly before can suddenly become a very tight squeeze. To be safe, I also did a quick dry fit without any glue. That way I could check whether everything lined up properly and make sure nothing was already putting pressure on the surrounding parts. 2001 brought some major aerodynamic regulation changes to Formula 1. The front wing had to be raised by 50 mm, reducing the ground effect and forcing teams to completely rethink their aerodynamic concepts. The rear wing was heavily restricted with fewer elements allowed and much less freedom in its design. These changes created a very different aerodynamic philosophy compared to previous years, and you can especially see that in the much simpler rear wing design of the Williams FW23. For the floor I went ahead and glued this piece in place right away. That way it becomes one solid assembly before moving on to primer. Once the primer was on, it was time to let it dry properly. That's something you really don't want to rush. Always make sure each coat has enough time to cure before applying the next one. After that, I sprayed the black paint, Revell Aqua Color 302, and then it was back to the drying rack once again. The cockpit received the same black primer, followed by a coat of metallic paint. I did go a little heavy with it though, and as it dried, the paint started to crack slightly. That's usually a sign that too much paint has been applied at once. I then picked out some of the smaller details with silver metallic paint and a brush. That's something I do quite often, simply because masking everything off for spraying usually isn't worth the extra effort. A fine brush or even acrylic paint markers work perfectly well for details like these. The rest of the cockpit was painted in a dark anthracite grey. Again, I applied it by brush. With enough thinner and a soft brush you can achieve a really smooth finish without any issues. The steering wheel wasn't actually shown like this in the instructions. However, after looking at a few onboard shots of the real car, I noticed that the outer rim was coated in a kind of matte blue fabric. I didn't have a suitable matte blue on hand, so I went with a gloss finish instead. It's not 100% accurate, but I still think it's a nice little detail. It helps the steering wheel stand out a bit more and adds some extra visual interest to the cockpit. When it came to the chassis, I decided to attach some of the smaller parts before painting. In my experience, it's much easier to work with a larger, complete assembly than to paint every individual piece separately, sand the contact points afterwards and then try to glue everything together cleanly. Gluing parts before primer and paint is simply easier and usually results in a stronger fit. I also painted and masked off the cooling ducts ahead of time so I could get those installed as well. With all of that taken care of, it was finally time to break out the putty. Up to this point I had always been applying putty with a toothpick. It's a method that works, but it's probably something I'll change for future projects. What I want to try instead is masking off the surrounding area and then spreading the putty across the seam. That should allow me to apply a bit more pressure and hopefully avoid trapped air bubbles or uneven spots in the filler. Quite often I end up with tiny pinholes that only become visible once the primer goes on. My primer is fairly thin and fine, which is great for preserving detail, but it won't completely fill imperfections like that. If the surface isn't perfectly smooth beforehand, the primer will make sure you notice. Once the putty had cured, I sanded everything smooth and gave the parts another wash to remove any remaining dust and residue. I actually washed the parts twice during a typical build, once to get rid of any mold release agents from manufacturing, and then again after sanding and filling to clean away all the leftover debris. After that I attached the final piece and sprayed everything with a coat of white primer. The goal here was to blend those repaired areas back into the surface and create a uniform base before moving on to paint. The biggest challenge of this build was definitely masking the transition between the white and blue sections of the livery. Unlike most kits, there wasn't any guide for this. The decal sheet only included the thin silver stripe that separates the blue and white areas, which meant I had to figure out the paint line myself and spray the colors separately. To get it as accurate as possible, I spent quite a bit of time studying reference photos and onboard footage of the real car. I even used parts of the decal sheet as a template, tracing the shapes onto masking tape with a pencil before carefully cutting everything out with a hobby knife. This was actually the first time I've had to do something like this. On previous builds, the large color sections were usually provided as decals. They might have been difficult to apply, but at least the shapes were already there. This is what the masking looked like in the end. Everything that's still exposed will now be painted blue. It definitely worked, but there's no question it's more work than simply applying a decal. For the paint I mixed Revell Aqua Color 51 and 54 in a 50-50 ratio and thinned it with Revell's water-based thinner. The mix worked quite well overall, although I think it could have used a little more thinner. The darker blue especially is quite thick straight out of the pot and doesn't flow as easily through the airbrush. Thankfully, the result turned out really well. The paint settled nicely over the primer, produced a smooth finish, and after plenty of drying time, the bodywork was finally ready for decals. I was really happy with how it turned out. You can see a little bit of paint bleed in a few spots, but overall the result was better than I had hoped for. The masking tape did its job. The paint line came out clean for the most part, and considering this was my first time tackling something like this, I can't complain. Now comes the real test. Let's see how well the decals fit over everything.
Boah, ich fasse es nicht, das passt. Das hätte ich ja im Leben nicht gedacht. Boah, das passt richtig gut. Das gibt's ja gar nicht. Das ist zu gut, irgendwas passiert noch. Irgendwas wird noch richtig passieren.
As you could hear, I was honestly surprised by how well everything fit in the end. This is also a good moment to talk about the decals themselves. You can really see the difference in quality here. Compared to older kits from the late 90s, this 2001 era sheet is on another level. The decals are much thinner, easier to handle, and they settle around the surface a lot more smoothly, which makes a huge difference in getting a clean result. The first one was a bit tricky to apply, but it still went on quite well. On the other side, I actually decided to cut the decal into 3 separate sections before applying it. That made the whole process a lot easier to control. I wasn't sure beforehand whether the seams would be visible, but in the end they are only slightly noticeable. From normal viewing distance you don't really see them at all, so I'd say it was a pretty solid workaround. After all the decals were applied, it was time for the clear coat. As always, this is probably the most critical step of the entire build, because it can really make or break the final result. At the start I used a different brand compared to my previous Ferrari build. The behavior was quite similar and it laid down nicely, but I seriously underestimated how much material you actually need. Once it dries, you end up with far less on the surface than it initially looks like. I'll come back to that in the problems section later on, because there were a few things worth discussing there. Overall though, the clear coat went on smoothly. It was properly thinned and it dried well. The finish itself looks good, but I'll go into more detail on that later. After that it was time for the final assembly. Before committing to glue, I always do a dry fit first, so make sure everything sits correctly. That way I still have the option to sand or file areas if something doesn't line up perfectly. While I still had access to the internal areas, I also painted the inner surfaces black and removed the masking from the cooling intakes. Painting those inner sections black helps a lot visually. It reduces light shining through the bodywork, makes the parts look more solid and hides small imperfections or overspray. It's actually a trick used in the real Formula 1 as well, where black paint is often used inside bodywork sections to conceal details and create a cleaner overall appearance. For the front wing I used a slightly different approach when it came to painting. I placed the parts directly onto tape, which meant the lower surfaces were left unpainted and slightly uneven in a few spots due to the way the paint built up at the edges. Since those underside areas of the end plates won't be visible on the finished model anyway, I simply sanded them smooth afterwards. That decision saved me a lot of time, especially compared to figuring out a complex way of holding the part so I could reach every angle during painting. I then assembled the wing first and went back in afterwards with the blue paint, touching up the previously white areas from below. In the end, none of that is visible, but it made the whole process significantly easier and more efficient. This part was also a bit tricky. I basically had to eyeball it and estimate where the decal lines would sit in order to figure out which areas needed to be painted blue and which ones had to stay white. In principle it was the same approach as with the chassis masking, just on a single part this time, which made the process slightly easier to manage but still required a fair bit of careful judgment. At this point I would have actually preferred to use the Keep Your Distance decal because I just really like it. The idea behind it is brilliant. However, that version was only used during testing. For the actual season the BMW power branding was applied instead, so I ultimately went with the more accurate option. In the end it's a small detail, but I wanted to stay true to the race spec version of the car. Especially on small or less visible areas, I prefer doing this by brush instead of masking everything for spraying. It's simply faster and, in my opinion, a much more efficient way of working. First of all, a huge compliment to Revell for the tires. What came out of the mold this time was genuinely impressive. No flash, no seams, no edges that needed trimming on the tread. Honestly, that's not something you see every day. What I usually do, just to push the realism a bit further, is lightly sand them down anyway. It removes that perfectly new out of the mold look. Any small rubber bits coming off just adds to the effect, because that kind of wear actually happens in real life as well. It makes the tires feel more used and much closer to what you'd see on an actual F1 car. In the end, I also clean up any remaining mold marks and trim off small rubber fragments so everything looks sharp and consistent. It's a small step, but it adds a lot to the overall realism of the model. I simply use an old toothbrush for this step. I don't have a special tool.
But what I do have is a statistic telling me that 97.7% of you watching right now aren't actually subscribed. So, if you're enjoying the video and want to see more like this, feel free to hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and it really helps the channel grow more than you think. Thanks.
And with that, all the individual parts were finished, and it was finally time for final assembly. At this point, I'll let the footage speak for itself and leave you with the build. In the end, I can only say that the rear wing really benefited from the 2001 regulation changes. The design is noticeably simpler, which made it easier to assemble and also helped it fit onto the model much more cleanly compared to previous builds. It's hard to call it an upgrade in the traditional sense, but from a builder's perspective, it definitely made the whole process more straightforward.
Was zitterst du so?
And that wraps up the build section. Thanks for sticking with me so far. Next up, we'll go through the issues I ran into during the build, and then I'll finish things off with a short outro. Now onto the issues I ran into during the build. The first thing I noticed was that a lot of the parts would have made more sense if they had been molded directly onto the chassis. For example, this upper section here, my guess is that it's just a result of how the kit was engineered. Probably separate tooling choices rather than anything functional. But it did feel slightly over-segmented in places. There were also a few areas that didn't quite line up properly. Some locating holes and raised sections simply didn't match in a way that made sense. Even when everything was positioned correctly, the fit just wasn't there. That was a bit confusing and I still don't really understand why it was designed that way. Another recurring issue was the putty work I mentioned earlier. Because I applied it without enough pressure, I ended up with small pinholes that the primer couldn't fill. My workaround was a bit experimental. I brushed on a heavier layer of primer to fill the gaps, and once it was dry, I sanded everything back to create a smooth surface. It worked, but it's definitely not the ideal solution. The real fix is to get the putty application right from the start, so you don't end up reworking everything later, with additional priming, sanding and repainting. There was also a classic instruction mistake. I trusted the manual again and got it wrong. It stated that part E should remain white and part G should be blue, meaning the outer sections would be blue. However, reference photos clearly show the opposite. The outer areas should actually be white with blue on the inside. Always check your references. I usually do, but in this case I relied too much on the instructions and paid for it. The same applies to another detail part where positioning was also incorrect in the manual. Reference images made it clear that it should sit much closer to the fuel filler area. There were also a few paint-related touch-ups. Some areas weren't perfectly masked, so a bit of bleed-through had to be corrected by brush. On top of that, after applying the decals, I had to go back in and fix a few sections where the base paint hadn't covered evenly. The goal was simply to achieve a consistent, uniform surface without visible imperfections. Originally, I also wanted to use the Allianz decals on the front wing end plates, but in the form provided they simply didn't fit properly. It would have caused more frustration than benefit, so I went with the alternative option instead. Another small issue was clearance on the front wing. The cutouts and locating points didn't quite match the raised sections, so I had to sand them down slightly to make everything sit flush. And finally, the clear coat. Even after multiple layers, second, third and even fourth passes, it still felt like there wasn't quite enough material on the surface. It improved over time, but ideally it would have needed even more to achieve the depth I was aiming for. Before we move on to the final reveal and you get to see the finished model, I just want to give a quick personal verdict. Overall, I'm really happy with how this build turned out. There were no major disappointments like with my Ferrari build where things simply didn't fit properly and the whole model ended up barely sitting straight on its wheels. This time everything came together much more cleanly. The only thing I can really criticize are the occasional mistakes in the instructions and the fact that I should have been a bit more patient with the clear coat. That's something I still struggle with sometimes. In fact, I already managed to create a small mark in the clear coat here, even though it had been drying for a day and a half. If there's one piece of advice I can give from this build, it's patience. Let things dry properly. Always give them more time than you think they need. Rushing this hobby only leads to frustration later on. Despite that, I absolutely love how the car looks. The livery is just beautiful and it's a shame we don't see designs like this anymore in modern Formula 1. I also really miss the BMW Williams era on the grid. It was a fantastic combination of speed, competition and iconic cars. But I'm drifting off a bit here. To wrap things up, a great model overall, with very little to complain about. Most of the issues were honestly self-inflicted, and that's just part of the learning process. Thanks for watching, and for sticking around until the end. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. I really appreciate it. Now, enjoy the final photos, and I hope to see you in the next one.